for the Drescher Center for the Humanities, and we are delighted to be here with you today, both in person and for those tuning in online. Today's event kicks off our Spring 2025 Humanities Forum, a free public lecture series organized by the Drescher Center. I would like to share with you our next event, which will take place in exactly 1 month. On April 9th, we will welcome novelist and writer Tommy Orange. Award-winning author Tommy Orange will be in conversation with community-based visual artist and folklorist Ashley Minner-Jones, who is a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. They will be talking about his recent novel, Wandering Stars. A follow-up to his best-selling debut, There, Wandering Stars traces the legacies of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School through three generations of a family. The event is free, but advance tickets are recommended. You can obtain them online at tickets.umbc.edu, and it'll also be live streamed as well. The event will take place on campus in the Linehan Concert Hall, which is in the Performing Arts and Humanities building at 6 p.m. To learn more, I encourage you to visit our website, dreschercenter.umbc.edu. And again, this afternoon's event is also being live streamed and will be later made available on the UMBC YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make some announcements. First, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all past, present, and future indigenous people connected to this place. While we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that truth-telling is only a small gesture, and we must take the action towards the necessary work of repair. Secondly, I want to take a moment to honor the memory of Dr. Daphne Harrison, Professor Emerita of the Department of Africana Studies, who recently passed in December 2024. A pioneering faculty member of UMBC's Department of Africana Studies, Dr. Harrison was named the founding director of the Center for the Humanities, which we now know as the Drescher Center, in 1996. She was also the founding director of the Humanities Scholars Program in 1992 and the early organizer of the Humanities Forum all the way back in 1987. Since Harrison's retirement in 2012, we have honored her with our annual Daphne Harrison Lecture Series, and this semester we are dedicating the entire series to her. Before I thank our co-sponsors, if you haven't yet entered our raffle for copies of Madness, please do so. They're on the back table. We're giving away 5 copies, and we'll announce the winners at the end of the talk and before the Q&A. And finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors. First, the brand new Critical Disability Studies minor housed in the Department of English. If anyone's interested in that, please visit the English department on the 4th floor in the POB. We'd also like to thank the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health, as well as the Office of Accessibility and Disability Services. Now, I'll introduce Earl Brooks, Associate Director of the Drescher Center and Assistant Professor of English, who will introduce our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Antonia Hylton is a Peabody and Emmy-award winning journalist at NBC News, reporting on politics and civil rights, and she is also the co-host of the hit podcast Southlake. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University, where she received prizes for her investigative research on race, mass incarceration, and the history of psychiatry. Joining her in conversation today will be Dr. Drew Holladay, Assistant Professor of English. Dr. Holladay's research combines rhetorical theory, disability studies, sociolinguistics, and digital humanities to examine writing about medicine, the brain, and mental health. Throughout his work, Dr. Holladay studies the effect of an increasingly potent biomedical ideology on discourses of mental health and how biological explanations of brain function and behavior are taken up in psychiatric and psychological research, as well as arguments in the legal and criminal justice systems, educational institutions, and government policies. Please join me in welcoming Antonia Hylton and Dr. Drew Holladay.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name, as Earl said, I'm Dr. Drew Holladay. Very glad to be with you all today and so happy to see a good turnout for this important event. And most of all, thank you, Antonia, for joining us here and sharing about not just your book and your research, but your life that you've poured into this book. So
thank you for having me.
Yeah. I wanted to start by thinking about the title of your book. You chose a word that is kind of notorious for having a lot of meanings. And you use that to great effect in the book as you call forth the different ways that madness is both cited in public discourse and psychiatric discourse, but also is a part of generational trauma and community life. How does this title resonate for you?
Well, very simply, the title is about everything but the patients inside this book and this story. And I make that clear, although typically that doesn't surprise my readers, I think. Once you get to the end of the book, you understand that. Madness is a reference to the system, because this is a story about the creation of an asylum here in the state of Maryland. But it sort of uses that asylum to tell a greater story about the foundation of psychiatry in the United States and many of the myths and stories that helped construct that foundation, inform the field, and that I argue and demonstrate through reporting, through oral history, continue to affect people, patients, and systems today. And I think most Americans in this moment think that our mental health care system is a little mad and messed up. Doesn't matter if you don't have health care or you have the best health care in the country. You can be stuck on months-long waiting lists trying to get an appointment. And if you're a person of color and you need a provider who may look like you or understand the community that you come from, you have it even worse. Mm-hmm. And I open the book in the introduction with a story about something going on in my own family, because I wanted not just to invite the reader into who I am and why am I narrating this story for you, why did I do this, why are you here with me, but also because I think a lot of people have family experiences like mine where they have loved ones who've suffered with mental illnesses. They themselves have maybe tried to find therapy or care and failed. And they're mad about it, or they feel like they've been driven mad by it. And while you kind of go there and into all of that emotion, it's also about kind of stripping away some of the shame that can be attached with that language as well. And so I think when I was thinking about, well, what am I going to call this story? It had to be a word that grabbed all of that and brought it together and made it very clear from you from the outset, well, what are you signing up for? What kind of journey are you going on with me? So I guess I landed at madness. And sorry, I keep knocking into this thing, but it just felt right. Mm-hmm. And from what I've heard from my readers, it felt right for them too. Yes, absolutely. I love what you're saying about the way that it brings all these different kinds of experiences together. I want to ask about your life, but I wanted to start first with your emphasis on patient stories, because that's something that is very commonly left out of the history of psychiatry. And people have suspicions about that, and I feel like when you read your book that some of those suspicions are justified, that there are difficult histories here that are not flattering for everyone. But it's still incredibly important to know this history. So how did you start, or how did you sort of build out from the patient stories and the stories about patients that you heard from nurses and other employees at the hospital? Yeah, I knew from the very beginning. And by the way, I was just a teenager at the very beginning of this. I was an undergrad trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life when I first found out about Crownsville. And I fell in love with the history of science. I literally stumbled into a lecture on the history of science. I didn't know that was a thing that someone could study. And I got to listen to this brilliant woman named Professor Anne Arundel describe the birth of the clinic and the asylum. And something just clicked for me. But very quickly, I realized I was going to have to do a lot of digging on my own, because the history of these systems is taught almost exclusively from the perspective of white people, sometimes white patients, but mostly the white providers and therapists and lawmakers and creators. And I knew instinctively, even at that very young age, something was very wrong with that, because I come from a family with a history of mental illness. And so I knew that there were hospitals full of Black patients. I knew that there were Black doctors who had innovated care. They just weren't really receiving the credit for it. So I found Crownsville, and then I found out that almost every state had a Crownsville, a Jim Crow segregated site for mental health care. And I quickly understood, okay, I'm going to have to get permission from the state of Maryland to get access to records. I want to understand patients through the files that may have been preserved. And that was a battle on its own. But then when I actually got into Maryland State Archives, I found that most of what the state preserved was, again, written almost entirely from the perspective of the people that created Crownsville and ran the place. And you have to keep in mind, a hospital founded in 1911, after years of debate following emancipation by exclusively white lawmakers and white doctors, meant that the people who were writing about its creation and about its early patients had extremely bigoted views of the people that they were supposed to care for. So I'm reading all of this material that is its primary source documentation and letters and hospital reports, but it became just shockingly obvious to me that I would need to launch an oral history project as well, and that I would really need to honor the lived experiences of people who were there, or at least the memories and stories and artifacts of the people who loved and respected and cared for them. And that's part of the reason this book took about 10 years to write, because finding people who are comfortable and competent and able to share their story with you, who've been in places like this, it's really challenging. And building trust in communities where trust has been broken by systems, by hospitals, it took a lot of work. There are people that you'll meet in this book who took literally 7 or so years to decide to speak to me. So between the first time I ever reached out to them and the time they actually agreed to interview, a lot of time went by. And as you said, often their voices are excluded, so there was just sort of the clear need to bring them to the table to tell the full story, and as a journalist, get all of those pieces there and allow them all to speak for themselves. But also I wanted this to be a different kind of book, a book that was accessible not just to psychiatrists and to professionals and to clinicians, but to patients themselves, to their family members, and to people who just needed to feel seen, or who maybe grew up in families like mine. I grew up in a family with a lot of conspiracy and fear around psychiatry. I had the kinds of parents who said, literally when I asked my parents for a therapist in high school, they said to me, "Oh, no, that's for white people." And to this day, if you talk to some of my family members, they will tell you that they think psychiatry is a form of white people mind control. And they are dead serious. And it's not really, I used to think when I was 16, 17, 18, that my parents were trying to hurt me, that they didn't care about my feelings, that they didn't care that I told them that I needed help in some way. But then when you see this story and you understand the way in which your parents and grandparents were harmed by, excluded from, abused by some of these places, you start to understand why they were so afraid of them and disengaged from them. And you start to reframe your interactions with them not as, oh, my parents are trying to deny me something, but actually that they were trying to protect me from something in their own way. And so for me, it's the writing and the relationships that I try to show you on the page, beyond just the facts of the story. They're all about removing the stigma and shame that's wrapped up in all of that, not just the story and the horrors or the problems with the institution itself, but also what those things do to communities and people, which is make them assign a lot of self-blame, make them stuff secrets, and family members literally hide people from the record, and to kind of, if I'm asking you to do the work of unpacking that for yourself or starting some of those new conversations with your friends and your family, I had to do that on the page with you too, and invite other people who'd lived that to do the same with me on the page. So that's what that was all about. I wanted it to feel like a very different type of book from the kind of psychiatric histories that are out there.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And as you were describing it, I was recalling, moments good and bad from the book of, the story of a family member who was at Crownsville for 27 years, and their relatives didn't know. And those kinds of stories that of course, they strike fear in people's hearts. Like that is heartbreaking and violent. But we also have, the nurse that you worked with who found like a dozen other people to come talk with you because they were so committed to telling this history in in this honest way to honor the people who lived there.
Yeah, and I often tell this story to other reporters as I try to get them to reframe and rethink about the way we do the work that we do. So, as a reporter, you're kind of trained to be a little bit skeptical of things people tell you, or at least to demand that you find many ways to back up and reconfirm what they share. And so in the early days of me doing this work, again, when I was a teenager, I would talk to some of the elders in Annapolis or in Baltimore, and they would say to me, back in the first half of the 20th century, there was the night doctor. And that's why so many people hated Crownsville, the night doctor. And I'd say, well, what does that mean? They'd say, at night, they would go out in vans and cars, and they would just scoop black kids up off the street and bring them to Crownsville. And I thought, again, I'm very young at this time, okay, that can't be real. To be totally honest with you, it sounded like something from Goosebumps. And then I heard it over and over and over again. And it was probably the 10th or 12th time somebody who didn't, and these people didn't all know each other, by the way, because this is a massive institution, hundreds of employees at any given time, 100 years of history. So I'm hearing about the night doctor over and over again in all of these communities in the sort of DMV area more broadly. And I realize that the night doctor is not a literal title for a job at Crownsville, but it was a real thing. And I was able to find families and find people who, as you said, were scooped up literally in the middle of the night, brought to this place. No family members were alerted, called, involved in the person's care. And so their loved one kind of becomes this ghost associated with this institution. And so the night doctor is less of a literal term, but it is a very real thing. And it really helped me as a young reporter think about what the truth is and how you listen to your sources and hear what they're really saying to you. And so, I wasn't going to go into the Maryland State Archives and find job listing from 1955, night doctor, you're going to go scoop people up at night. But I was able to find evidence that people had really experienced that. And so when you really listen to people and you get to know people and you build relationships, you hear and you understand and you report on them differently. And I think one of the things that's so maddening sometimes for me when I think about my own book and the work that I've done is that there are lots of, and have been lots of, talented reporters in Baltimore and in Annapolis and in Washington, D.C. for hundreds of years, and they didn't do a lot of that work. They didn't go to those people and ask them a follow-up question about the night doctor. Mm-hmm. They didn't treat the stories and the fears they had as real and put them on the front page of their paper. And the institution closed in 2004. I think that's within all of our lifetimes. I don't know about some of the undergrads here, but I think so. I was a kid in 2004 still. So for me to be the first person who's able to sort of put those pieces together, it's an honor and I'm very glad, but it's also a little bit of an outrage that a community could carry this kind of information for so long and these experiences, that there could be these kinds of patterns over and over and over again. And I guess it took this long for it to come out. But it helped me understand why people have the kind of anger they have toward institutions like Crownsville or Johns Hopkins, because there's decades of this. The oral history, the stories that are passed on, the hurt and the trauma that people feel and interpret and remember. And this is a book that's as much about the, physical space and the science and the policy as it is also about sort of the psychological experience of going through all of those things. And so that for me was such a central part of how I thought about putting this story together.
Yeah, I hear in the way that you're explaining this and in the way that you have planned for the reader and empathize with the reader, this kind of shared journey through learning about how these systems work. And it seems like many people are only aware of either the stereotypes in pop culture about mental hospitals and the patients that live there, or they have essentially whatever is the party line in psychiatry at the moment, and don't see much of the connections outside of that. But I think you do a really brilliant job of showing how even people just living in communities and white communities fighting to stay segregated, how those were immediate parts of the experience of those patients, that it wasn't disconnected, but it was part of the same thing. And I wondered if, I think for me, when I think about the Night Doctor story and how it sounds conspiratorial, and it is exactly the kind of thing that might get someone put in the hospital. That you can see how there didn't need to be a top-down institution to make all these things happen. That it was the governor looking the other way. It was the attorney general looking the other way. It was the local officials being pressured, even their lives threatened by local residents, with even small changes to the size of the institution or the location. I wonder if you could speak about that, about this network of systems that doesn't have a director or a leader, but ends up putting all of these things into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's one of the things that you have to kind of accept or understand when you study any system, is I think sometimes when people hear, and of course there's a lot of criticism now of thinking about things as systemic in our culture and our country's own battle over how it's going to remember itself. But one of the things that makes them so effective is that there doesn't really need to be a single administrator or person who enacts the inequity or the injustice or who makes the system evolve in the way that it does. It's more that there are these foundational myths and attitudes that inform the way in which people show up and work in these spaces, that inform the literal ways in which they are constructed. And to help you see that, I want to explain the origin story of the hospital a bit for anyone who hasn't yet read the book.
Yes, please.
So the hospital was founded in 1911 after years of debate in Maryland and around the country around what white lawmakers are describing at the time as sort of the problem of Negro insanity. And they are debating with each other in medical journals, in newspapers, in letters, about what they see to be black people who just seem to be really emotionally struggling in the years after slavery's end. Some people theorize, well, slavery was kind of hard and terrible for them, so maybe they're still suffering from some trauma related to that. But a whole lot of people, particularly in the South, shoot that down. And they come to believe that actually black people are so fundamentally biologically different from white people that they are unable to handle the rigors of being free. And therefore, even though we already have state institutions for the treatment of mental disorders or developmental differences in the state of Maryland, we actually need to create a new one just for them. So that's why they create Crownsville. So Crownsville is created, and there are lies baked into that already. Black people are mentally different. They actually, the best thing for them is hard labor and enslavement, and when they stray from that, they are lost. So that informs a number of things. The decision, for example, to force the patients to build the asylum for themselves. The only patients in the state of Maryland who have to build their own hospital from the ground up. The state of Maryland marches 12 black men into a forest, modern-day Bacon Ridge area, and there's no cabin there for them, there's no place for them to rest. They are put to work immediately. And more of them are added over the course of 3 months to a group, until they reach a group of about 150. And it includes boys as young as 11, 12 years old, by the way, who are doing this work. And if you've ever had the chance to drive on Crownsville Road, or you do get the chance to drive around right outside Annapolis, you should go see these buildings that they built, because they still stand more than 100 years later. But then after they construct their own wards and rooms and therapy spaces, the hospital forces them to run a massive, highly productive, modern farm, to create a carpentry shop, a rug shop, to sell goods, to offset the cost of their own care, to an extent that, again, no other patient group in the state was ever asked to do. And so from the jump, the get-go, Crownsville is very different from Springfield, from Spring Grove, which is very relevant to where we are right now, from the Rosewood Hospital, which was not far down the road from Crownsville. And that was all informed, again, by beliefs and attitudes that had sort of been legitimized by these different layers in a system, from lawmakers and governors to administrators and sort of middle managers to, all the way down to aides who come in and work in this site, and to the literal ways in which the floorboards were hammered into the bedrooms. All of that is informed by the sort of story of the system that's told at the beginning. And so even when you get to the end of the book, and you are in this hospital that's struggling and sort of trying and failing to reinvent itself and to continue serving its community in the late 90s and 2000s, I'm able to show that the hospital is still impacted by all those decisions that were made back in 1911. And so that's sort of the power of the lies that we tell ourselves, is that they can set all these things in motion that are really, really hard to undo without intentionality. And then, of course, it makes it really, really hard to figure out who to blame to, who to go to for recourse. Certainly, many of the people and patients and former employees still feel they actually don't know who to go to and what to do as they try to search for meaning today. And so I'm glad that you picked up on that, because there are all these layers and people and parts that are complicit in this. And you touched on this too, that there's even the relationship to neighbors that just have maybe no technical association with the hospital but live nearby, who are afraid of the patients, who then advocate for more carceral measures. At one point, they even want to build a wall. You see all these ways in which what's happening all around Maryland and around the United States it's critical to understand to make sense of the institution, and the institution helps us make sense of what's going on outside too. And so I remember getting an email from one of my early readers saying, I wish like, I didn't want to learn all that other stuff about Maryland history. They didn't want to hear about the chapter that deals with the history of lynchings in Maryland and all that. I wish you just stayed inside the hospital walls. And I wrote back to them, I said, I can't do that. You can't understand what's happening inside the hospital walls if you don't understand what's going on out there. And so the book has to weave in and out very, very intentionally. Because again, I'm using this site to tell a very American story. It's not just the story of Crownsville, it's a story that implicates all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking of, well, there's a historian of science that you probably know, Thomas Kuhn, who talks about how scientific fields have this kind of incentive to ignore their history and present knowledge as just coming out of the present moment kind of from nowhere. And that when you look into that history, you see that it's a lot messier and more complicated than it looked at first. And I think psychiatry is absolutely, and medicine are in this boat where attention is directed toward what we think we know now, rather than what we actually know and have documented about the past. Why do you think this cycle keeps going?
Well, I think that the field, and again, I'm speaking as a journalist, so I'm sure some people have criticisms of what I think of this. But in my observations and reporting, I think that in the field of psychiatry in particular, there's always been this pressure to legitimize, to prove, to explain, and to be seen as equal to sort of other parts of the sciences and medical field. And in that rush to legitimize, I think they've undermined themselves at many points and turns. Particularly when it comes to their dealings in communities of color. Mm-hmm. And one of the themes that I show in this book too is that when it comes to mental health care, what I've found in the stories from Crownsville are that as important as medicine and technological developments are, the real constant that seems to make a difference in that space is actually community and people and relationships. And with the caretakers and doctors and nurses at Crownsville who have the most success, they're not just the best at therapy or the most aggressive with medication. They had a very community-centered mindset. So they were the kind of doctor that personally drove their patients to appointments. I write about a pioneering psychiatrist at Crownsville named Dr. Brian Sims, who still lives in and works in Maryland today. One of the first people to introduce the concept of trauma-informed care there, who develops a program where, as the federal government is trying to push the state of Maryland and everyone in the US at this point in the latter half of the 20th century is doing this, they're trying to get patients back to the community, back home, go to clinics instead of being stuck in these mammoth institutions. So Dr. Sims signs up for all of that. And he decides he's going to go and check on his patients. He's going to take them to appointments. He's going to visit them at home and see, are you staying on your medication? How's your relationship with your family? Are you going to school like you said you would? And he is able to drop recidivism rates down to single digits for the first time in Crownsville's history. But after about a year of running that program, the state informs him they don't think that work is very valuable, and they make him stop. And then I think of, and you referenced her a little bit earlier, Faye Belt, the Belt family. The mom, Gertrude Belt, is one of the first black nurses to get the opportunity to work at Crownsville. And then her daughter, who grows up on the hospital's grounds, she becomes a nurse there as well. And she ends up treating one of her own childhood friends, who's admitted there when Faye is still pretty young and new in her career. And Sonia, her friend, who I write about, credits, She doesn't remember the name of the medication she was put on. She doesn't really remember any of her conversations with the psychiatrist on her ward. But she does remember that every day, Faye Belt walked all around the campus with her, sat in the grass with her, cried with her, called her mom, made sure she got homemade meals brought into her room, helped her get access so that she could play basketball, which was her favorite sport, every day. And she ended up actually even teaching some of the other patients basketball, like helped her build a life there and reminded her every day, you're not here for long. You have a whole life and a whole story. This is a chapter, but it's not the whole story for you. And Sonia credits that kind of relationship building as having saved her life and as being what she really returned to and thought about when she reached other lows in her life. And it helped her survive those too. And so I share all that to say, I guess, that medicine, science, all of these things, as important and wonderful and valuable as they are sort of nothing if you don't have community and relationships and people inside them and holding them up. And certainly this sort of dream here in the United States that we had, that we could close these institutions down and people would go back home, stay on their medication by themselves and figure it out, has so obviously not worked. And it's not because we're missing some new pill. At least this is not what the reporting shows. It's not because we're missing some new pill or some new hypnosis technique or something. When you talk to the patients and you talk to the people who are seeing this whole system fall apart every day, it's because community is missing. And again, that's not to discount all the other elements here, but it's just that I think sometimes the people who work in and develop and push and are so proud of these things, they forget what the relationships that must be there to make them work. And this story is really, I guess, a call for action in a way, call to action in a way, because we need to get back to thinking about this as a communal issue.
Absolutely, yes. And I, in the book, you describe how when the hospital is integrated kind of against the wishes of most of the white employees at the time, and while the hospital was under the direction of someone who had fled the Holocaust, and how the experiences of trauma that were shared was something that helped them make connections with the patients, and it made it made the actions of other employees feel so distant. But you do see people who come in and see that the need is not a drug, but that there are people who need support.
That was one of my favorite parts of Crownsville's story to report on. In the 40s, a man named Jacob Morgenstern comes to work at Crownsville after just nearly escaping murder by the Nazis. His family is able to come to the United States. He is able to get a job as a psychiatrist at Crownsville. And he is able to understand the patients there and able to build a coalition with Black employees and the NAACP and Black attorneys around the state, because he recognizes Crownsville for what it is, which is an apartheid state, an apartheid institution. It's a hospital that for the first 40 years of its existence is all about the treatment of Black patients, but won't allow a Black person to work there. He steps into the role as superintendent and inherits that job from the man who stood in the woods and demanded that 12 Black men start building the hospital for themselves. A guy who had immense affection for the antebellum era and all the aesthetics that came with it, who designed himself a mansion on the hospital's property that looks a whole lot like a big house on a plantation. And so this Jewish man comes, and he's moving into that home. And there are all of these parts of the story that some of them make me laugh and some of them make me cry. One of the ones that kind of made me laugh was that, so him and his wife arrive, and they are, working with the administration at the hospital as they prepare to take over this role and move into the big house. And the staff associated with Dr. Robert Winterrode, who had been the founder of this place and had designed the home, they're really nervous about this couple basically bringing their European Jewish, vibe into Crownsville, to put it bluntly. And so they're really hung up on the aesthetics of it all. Like, oh, can we pick out your furniture, please? Can we design the house for you? And Dr. Morgenstern's like, sure, do that. And while they do that, he's sort of secretly beginning his relationship with the NAACP and getting ready to integrate the staff. And so they kind of end up like missing the real thing that's coming because they're all worried that, I don't know what they thought he was going to do to that house. But, and so, it's a story about how outsiders are able to see the truth before insiders. And when you've been through horror, you kind of don't have anything to lose. So he was willing to risk relationships. He was willing to elevate someone like Dr. Vernon Sparks, a pioneering Black psychologist who comes into Crownsville and begins doing groundbreaking work, and then mentors an entire generation of Black psychologists and psychiatrists, some of whom are still doing talk therapy here. For example, Dr. Jim Ballard, who is, I think, 84 or 85 now, lives in Annapolis and still sees 40 patients a week for talk therapy, and is unwilling to retire because he knows he's one of the only Black men still available to do that for people. But he is one of the people who was inspired by this relationship. And so all the patients who are interacting with this man are benefiting from the work that Dr. Sparks and Dr. Morgenstern did there. And so it's about the way that outsiders come in and can break rules, can reform, and can tell the truth when other people have been so lost in the lies that the system they've been comfortable in have allowed them to sort of believe, assume, and perpetuate.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, in kind of moving toward your own experience with the research and connections with your family, about the experience of writing this book that is a history book, it's a memoir. There are just so many genres kind of tied together here, and it seems like that was something that very organically grew out of this research process that did not end up like you expected it to be. So for other students and grad students here, and researchers like me, if you could talk about that experience.
Sure. I think maybe the best way to answer that question is to tell you a little bit more about how I arrived at even caring about a place like Crownsville at all. And often when I tell people that story, I tell them that there's kind of two origin stories. There's the easy one, which I told you already, which is that I'm in college, I stumble into this lecture, I find out about the history of science, I become obsessed with it, blah, 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 and then I find out about Crownsville. But I think the more truthful story goes back to my childhood and my relationship with my parents and my grandparents and family. When I was 11 years old, a bunch of my cousins had been visiting my house. I'm one of 7 kids, and I have like 30-something cousins. And they'd all left. I see my dad alone in the kitchen. I go up to him to talk to him, and I ask him, do you have cousins? Because it kind of just hit me that at 11, I didn't know if I had ever met any of my dad's cousins before. And so he starts to explain to me, well, one of your uncles is actually a cousin. Another one of my cousins I've lost touch with. One is incarcerated. And then he says, and my favorite cousin, the person I spent my whole childhood looking up to, wanting to be, is dead. He was killed by a police officer in the middle of a mental health episode on a the steps of a federal building in Mobile, Alabama. And I was 11 years old, so I was like, I don't even remember if I said anything after that. I do remember the look in my dad's eye, which was sort of like, don't ask me any more questions about this. And then as I got older, you hear the rumors and you start to fill in some blanks. And so I started to hear stories about my father's cousin, Maynard. I started to hear stories about my father's grandfather, Clarence, who was sent to a segregated ward of an institution in Michigan. And I saw, as I got to know my father and the rest of my family, not just as authority figures and parents, but as friends and people who were complex, I started to see all the ways in which those traumatic experiences had changed them. And so for me and my siblings, there was some of this frustration because we knew things and we heard rumors, but it was really hard to get my father or other people to talk about what they'd gone through. And so I just ended up kind of searching for understanding on my own. So that's, I think, the real story, the reason why then, when I stumbled into that class, I was pulled right in because I realized, oh, all the things my dad wouldn't answer, I can figure them out for myself here. I think this woman, this professor will help me. It turned out to be right. And then, while I was writing the book, a loved one of mine experienced psychosis. And it was during the pandemic. It was around the time of January 6th. And me and a whole lot of my family members were fighting day in and day out to find them something that could help them. And we were informed that there was not a single Black psychiatrist or therapist available in the state in which my loved one was living. We tried to get them signed up for all kinds of community programs, and we were told that there were months-long waiting lists. And then we got to see all the kind of horrors and hypocrisies and inconsistencies in the system. So, for example, there would be these moments when my loved one was going through things that seemed to be such a crisis that people would, their neighbors or others would call the cops on them. And the cops would enter my loved one's home. And me and my family would be terrified about what was going to happen to them. And we were informed in those moments that what they were going through was such a crisis, they immediately needed to be sectioned and brought to a hospital and basically forced into mental health care treatment for 72 hours. But then we would, on the next phone call, be told we have to wait 6 months for them to get access to a program. And so we couldn't make sense of that. These emergencies and then these long waits, and you're not quite good enough and you're not quite an emergency enough that you deserve this, but you are such an emergency that there's a cop here. Like, it was very, very confusing for us. And we have health insurance. And we have resources. We have a whole lot of people in the family who were pooling their resources together to fight for this person. And it was all falling apart. And so I was writing this book and living that experience. And it was horrible. It was really, really hard. But it did bring me closer to a lot of the people who you'll meet in this book. Because I just understood what they did or what they had been through on a newly personal level. And my relationship with them changed from the sort of regular reporter-subject relationship to, I'd finish an interview or gathering photographs from their home, and then they would ask me about how my loved one was doing, and they'd give me some advice or things that, hey, ask their doctor this. They helped me out. And so I actually got to benefit from what it was like to have, Black caretakers and a community help me through the process. So I lived that in real time. So it changed the way I had to write this book. It changed my relationship with the reader. And it kind of just lit this fire in me where this was not just some story, some history I thought deserved to be out there, but I realized, oh my God, if my family can't figure this out, there must be a whole lot of families that are struggling, harder than my family is struggling, who maybe feel all the embarrassment and the hurt and the confusion and the shame that we're all feeling, and maybe this will make them feel less alone. And I need to say that in this book too. And so that's why the genre, I think, kind of just like, I don't know, it broke apart, it got a little bit messy. I wanted all those people, all those things to be invited to the table, to be on the page, and that was the only way I knew how to do it.
I really appreciated it, and I feel like it's a groundbreaking book in a lot of ways, and not just in terms of the information, but the style in which it was written.
Thank you.
And you're sharing that history about your family, and also we may not have time. One more question? Okay. Just one. Okay. In your story there, talking about your own experiences, I think I hear something that I've read a lot in the research that I've done around mental health activism and institutionalization. And it's that there's often a very strong public narrative that is saying that the problem is that we need access to mental health care, we need more medications or fewer medications, and we need to fund research, but that people aren't necessarily seeing behind the scenes how it works. And I think there was a story that ProPublica reported a few years ago about a woman in Arkansas, I believe, who had just experienced the death of a loved one and thought, what do I do? Like, I'm extremely depressed. I should go check myself into a hospital, because a hospital is where you get care. This is where you go when these kinds of things happen. And she ended up stuck there for months, and the leader of the unit wouldn't let her go, and it turned out he eventually got caught for a lot of fraud. He essentially was keeping patients as long as possible to keep claiming them for his own financial benefit. And I just wonder about how, like, our misunderstandings that are fed by that narrative of that things are okay and we don't need to pay attention, that we can say that people are doing what they say they're doing behind the walls, and then experiencing that it's not that way. Like, how would you how do you connect with people who maybe are not aware of this history and try and get them to that place of understanding?
Well, there's a few things going on there, which is, one of the things that allows these systems, again, to be so successful in sort of perpetrating the story they want to tell about how all of this works, is that when it comes to psychiatry, it's very easy to discredit the people in your care, the story they tell, the complaints they may have. And that was a theme in this book too, that patients were starting to write letters to reporters and try to describe what was going on inside Crownsville. And certain papers just really wouldn't cover their perspective. It was really only the Black community paper, the Afro-American papers here in Maryland, that treated patient testimony as real, as valuable. But often, patients' stories are doubted if they're told at all. And so that allows for people who've maybe never experienced these the first time they might have to assume all is well, to assume that the story they've been told is the truth, because people who have an alternate story, they haven't been given the same weight, the same platform. And then I think there's another thing going on here, which is that I think in our culture, especially after the decisions we made in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s to let this whole thing unravel the way that it has, is that now your mental health is your problem. It is your individual problem. You feel terrible, you feel suicidal, there's an app for that. You should download it, start meditating. Start calling around to all the doctors in the city that you live in, see if you can get on one of those wait lists. It's on you, put the work in, keep calling, keep emailing, stay on top of them. keep track of all the paperwork you need to fill out. It's when you try to figure out what you are going to do, it's all these things that are your responsibility alone, and often it costs a whole lot of money. Yoga classes, all these apps and stuff, you can find yourself spending thousands of dollars a year and not getting any better at all. And so we've, again, substituted, and this is not to say that I miss the mammoth institution and I think we should bring that back. But we told people we were going to build a system of community care and clinics. We did not do that. And now we're evolving the story a little bit to tell them that it is your responsibility to go sit at home and fix your mental health. And so that's part of the problem too, that when people are told that this is something I have the tools to do this. I got to do this thing on my phone and it's on me. That they are going to be a little bit less likely to come forward and demand their, local officials, the politicians they vote for, their city council members, actually do something about this. And then when the failures do kind of spill out into public view, it might be easier and it might make a little more sense for them to blame the patient and the person. I live in New York City. I see this happen all the time. I was there and I covered Jordan Neely, and I closed the book with the story of Jordan Neely for a reason. And the way in which these moments in which sort of the crisis of our mental health crisis spills out into public view, you find that a whole lot of people are very comfortable making it an individual story about one person's actions and tendencies or failures or decisions they made. And people are very uncomfortable doing the looking around and wondering, did I play a part in this? Did I have some responsibility? Was there something I should have done or demanded of the people around me so that we didn't get here? And I think the good news is people are starting to talk more openly about the fact that they are seeking therapy. They are destigmatizing these conversations. People of all political backgrounds want to talk about mental health, even if they use different language or they have a different touch point. I've covered the opioid crisis in Appalachia, and I've covered gun violence in Philadelphia. And people may use different language, but they actually are talking about the same thing most of the time. And so we're at this moment where I think a lot of people want change. They want something here. They don't know the history, and they're still being pushed, this narrative pushed on them that it's for them to figure out. But if we can get past that piece, I do think there's something interesting there. We could be at a moment when the tide turns, the conversation changes a little bit, and something can be done. I don't know if that answered the question you asked me.
It was a beautiful
But
answer.
I feel very strongly about this, both as just a regular person who's needed to access care myself and felt like, why does this feel like an immense amount of homework or something, and you feel so alone in trying to do it, despite being told there's so many options and resources and things out there for you. And then, so there's the personal here, there's the reporting, and there's the political. But I am ultimately optimistic, though, that because all of these things spill out into the public, and that because people are debating, even if sometimes the debate goes off the rails, they're talking about these things in public now, that we could be in the moment right before something really changes. That's what I hope, that's what I believe. And I hope to be part of and to cover and to help inform how all of that shakes out.
Yes, thank you so much. I know that your book is going to be part of that movement and that change. Can we thank Antonia again for...
Thank you all for being here. And thank you for a great conversation. I appreciate you.
I'm trying to get pictures for you.
Oh, thank you.
Courtney, do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do have time for questions. But before we do that, I want to do the raffle.
Oh,
In
yes.
case people have to sneak away. So again, we're giving away 5 copies of the book. And Tony, do you want to draw the names?
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Lovely handwriting. I'm not sure I know how to pronounce your name.
Sanjana Sane, ticket number 689042. Yes?
Oh,
there
yes. Amazing.
There you go.
Do you have a pen? Do you want me to sign it for you? Yes. Let me see if somebody has it.
I've got one here.
Okay. Let me seal that.
Okay.
Just in case you
While
have to
she's
run.
doing that, I'm gonna grab the next one. Next one is Lota Akanewe, ticket number 689058. There you go. If you want her to sign it, she can sign it for you.
I got you.
Next one is Maryam J, number 689030. Going once, going twice. Okay. Want to pick the next one?
Joseph Van Jones.
There we go.
Let me sign it real quick. Nice to meet you.
Okay, we got two more. Next one is Faith Benson, 689. Ah, come on up. That's for Faith. And then last one, shake it up really good. And Ruben. All right. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and I will do my best to get to the microphone to you in time. And also for those of you who are watching at home, if you have questions, type them in the chat and I'll try my best to put them in. All right.
Thank you so much for this wonderful piece of work.
Thank you.
I read it. It was wonderful, and I had not known anything about this hospital that was 12 miles from where I've lived for 30 years.
Wow.
So what I wanted to ask you is, I know you're aware that the county, Anne Arundel County, is building a memorial park there, and I wondered what your thoughts are about that. I know it's in the planning stages and it's multi-generational outlook, but what are your thoughts on that as a sort of a fitting tribute and act of social justice with regard to this? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes. So for anyone who's not familiar, as she just said, the county is creating a memorial park, a small museum, and they're also going to rehab some of the old buildings. A lot of them are in pretty terrible shape right now, but the bones, the structures are still pretty good. And they're going to give them or rent them out to community organizations, to groups, to provide housing for veterans or for the elderly. And you'll start to see some of these changes by this spring. But as she said, this is a multi-generational thing. So I have a few thoughts about it. The first is, I think it is great that there is an effort and an investment in now telling the story and being honest about what happened there. The hospital has been, since it closed in 2004, for 20 years, it's been sitting there. People drive by it every single day. And there wasn't so much as a simple historical marker. The state really never told the story of who built the place. I mean, just basic stuff. And so I am grateful that between the Governor Moore's office and Stuart Pittman's office, that there is now interest in the history and the story. I do think that when you hear from your politicians that something is going to take generations and years, that means they're not going to be in office to execute on all of this. And so if you care about it and you want to see it happen, it means that this is a multi-generational project for you too. So if you live nearby, you have to show up to the public meetings and tell whoever is there in 2 and 4 years what you expect and what you want. You need to hold the groups that get access to these spaces accountable. Are they opening the kinds of programs and welcoming the kinds of patients they told you they would? You know, at one point, I know, for example, that members of the Black community in Annapolis were upset because some people in town or in the city were advocating for the construction of a lot of pickleball courts there. And there was fear, well, who's going to use the pickleball courts? And what community is going to feel most welcomed by that? And is the Black community actually going to come and use this site? So how do we make sure that it doesn't just acknowledge what happened to Black people there, but it also makes Black people feel welcome there? So these are all things that require that there's leadership in place that still care about them, but also that there are people there to hold all those people and things, you know, accountable for what they say they're going to do. And so I think it is a great start, but I think there's a whole lot of work ahead for people. And again, it's about that community piece of, if this all falls apart, it's going to be the fault of more than just one person. And if it all works, it's going to be credit to hundreds, maybe thousands of people here in the state making a difference through that site.
Okay. We have a question online, and then we'll go back to the audience. Someone asked, what do you hope policymakers, mental health professionals, and historians take away from this book?
Ooh. Well, that community piece is a huge one. Certainly, I think if you are drafting policy, or if you are a startup working in the mental health care space, I hope you are thinking about not just what you're going to charge patients and how popular or useful the thing that you're creating is, but how it accounts for and encourages community. I hope that people are consulting and working with providers of all backgrounds as they draft policy. There are a whole lot of really fascinating Black mental health leaders in the US. I got to speak to some of them for this book, and a lot of them have incredible ideas about what we could do to change the system. Dr. Brian Sims, again, psychiatrist from Crownsville who still lives here in the state and works on all these issues every day, has a lot of interesting ideas about what we could build to replace and reframe the sort of community clinic concept that we had decades ago. And those people are here and they're ready to do the work, but people need to listen to them, give them a platform, bring them to the Capitol, let them speak. And I really hope, again, that we're inches away from that, because when we're ready for it, they're here and they've got plans. Someone just has to let them execute on them.
After this one question, we're going to do two more questions, so raise your hand if you have a question. Okay. We'll do you, and then we'll hear. Okay.
I guess I have a more general question on, I guess, the process of getting it published, because I'm in a lot of Black creative spaces, and I've kind of seen that there's kind of like a disconnect between like the Black creators that get published and like the other ones that don't really. Like, did you face any specific pushback when you were trying to get it published? Like from people saying, oh, they don't want this, or oh, you should change it to be like this or something. So I was just wondering if like you had, especially like from like, I guess, general white agents and publishing houses.
So I do not have a white agent, and I don't have a white editor. My editor is one of the few Black women who doesn't just edit at a major publishing house, but runs an entire imprint. And I was very intentional about that. I wanted to be edited by and be in conversation with someone who would understand, especially when it became clear to me that there were elements of memoir and personal experience there. I knew I wanted that kind of closeness in the process, so I sought that out very intentionally. But I will say in the months right before my book came out, the kind of backlash that we're seeing all over the country was kind of getting into full swing. And I do remember hearing from some people, not my editor, but others, that they were wondered if my book would sell, if people really wanted to hear this kind of thing anymore. And I actually went through this period, a couple weeks right before my book came out, of being like really horrified and afraid and worried about the negativity. And then there was just this massive 180 and reversal where I realized, actually, there's a huge audience still for this work. that my job as a journalist, as a writer, as a creative, is to do and tell the things I need to tell, and to not be trying to read all the tea leaves and to go where the wind is blowing, but instead to kind of stop people in their tracks. And I've been so grateful to see that this book has been able to do that. I don't know how else to put it. You know, there are definitely people who are not going to, may ban this book from certain classes. I've gotten emails from people who asked me why I had to write about Black people in a hospital and why I couldn't focus on all patients, that kind of thing. I thought I would care more than I actually do. Your job is to go make all the things you were put on this planet to make. And lots of people will try to get in your ear as a young Black woman and try to tell you who to be and how to be and what to write and what's going to make you popular and what's going to make this sing. You have to find who you are. And what I tell other young people trying to figure out who they are, especially in spaces like this one, because I literally found this story when I was your age, is that thing that lights a fire in your stomach and is so interesting to you that even if all your friends and your family members said, that's so boring, I don't care, you'd still do it. That's a sign from the universe or from whatever you believe in that you need to keep at that thing and caring about that thing and finding community around that thing. And this story was that for me when I was in school. And so do you. I guess that's, yes, you have to pay attention to what's going on. Yes, there are people who I'm sure are not giving Black authors the offers and the opportunities that they deserve. But there are the people still there who will. And you have to just be you. And your moment and your time and your people will come as long as you're authentic.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you deeply for your tenacity and your empathy and your eloquence around this subject.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, having been a journalist myself for 20 years on a different level, but I'm wondering, you must have a tremendous amount of information that did not make it into the book. And then you're also thinking as you're going through this, figuring out what happened and what the stories are and how they affected people and maybe what happens next. Are you going to do something with all of that that sort of follows along with this story? What comes next?
So I think a few things come next. Some of what the state of Maryland may do on the property may be informed by my work. And so I'm engaged with and very hopeful around that process. I'm helping and sort of consulting on, but really on the side, because at this point, I feel like I, as a journalist, kind of create this thing, hand it over to others, and then have to let the community own what comes next. But the community is now in a process of doing a new oral history project around the hospital. And so I'm helping, even if it's just as simple as best practices or training people who are interviewing someone for the first time. And then, there may be other opportunities around this story that I can't comment on at this time. But there may be other mediums through which this story can be told at some point. And so I'm looking at all those things. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your visit, Antonia. I've been able to preview the book, and I look forward now to doing a deeper dive into it. And I really appreciate your visit here to talk about these issues. As an anthropologist, my question is usually kind of grounded in culturalistic explanations for these things. And I always find myself stumbling across Black cultural idioms of distress and the way that Black communities talk about experiences with mental health and institutionalization. And so, and often when I come across this, I see things related related that kind of interface religion and spirituality and kind of the conceptions we think about when it comes to the supernatural in conversation with psychopathology. And I'm wondering if in your storytelling or if in your research you came across, to what extent you may have come across that, even as you kind of navigate these stories that from your own family's perspective and in the stories that you're telling from the patients at this hospital. As someone else who also has had a loved one go through kind of the process of several times being hospitalized and now kind of relying exclusively on kind of religious explanation to both explain what has happened to her and the kind of facing of evil that she experienced in a psychiatric unit. I'm really curious, as a cultural anthropologist, though, what that means and how you've come across it in your own work.
There is a lot of it. And it's just sort of naturally woven in there because I let people, and I tried to tell their stories to you the way they told them to me. And so, for example, I talked about the Belt family, a mom named Gertrude Belt, her daughter Faye Belt, who come up at Crownsville, devoted Christians. And for them, the work of treating patients, the sort of act of becoming a nurse is an almost religious experience. It is a form of Christ-like service for them. The relationships they have with their patients are informed by their theology, informed by their relationship with the spiritual. And then I think also the entire practice of oral history in Black communities is sort of naturally blends with all of that. And that, I interviewed people who practice Reiki, who have severed their relationship with the church, who have their own unique way of understanding the universe. But for all of them, the work that they do was very, very spiritual. And some of the patients describe their relationships, too, with providers who they loved as a kind of spiritual bond as well. And so I think it's a very common way for people to make sense of their mind and make sense of these experiences. And for many, I found specifically for many of the Black nurses and doctors who were part of this sort of first wave, first generation who came in the late 40s and 50s, so first people to desegregate the institution, that the way that they actually are able to kind of make sense of some of the horrors and racism and abuse that they saw is that they saw themselves as kind of people who are entering this sort of lion's den, this thing in which they know there is evil, and in which it's sort of their job to put one foot in front of the other every day and try to save and support as many people as they can to kind of focus on just what's in front of them. And that's how they kept themselves mentally safe on a job that could be incredibly traumatic and dangerous at times. And so when I would sort of hear the patterns in which they would talk about these things, the spiritual was often really blended in with that. And so you'll see that, I think, just naturally there in the book. One of my favorite memories with Faye was taking this sort of secret tour of the hospital's grounds with a security guard who, like when he first saw us, wanted to kick us off the campus, but then had this interaction with Faye where they just sort of spiritually clicked with each other. And I sort of got to witness what that is like for someone who realizes they're with someone who gets what they're privately battling with, and see them develop this sort of immediate relationship and understanding of each other in real time. And so I don't want to spoil for you kind of what that scene is like, but I think you'll see a lot of what you've studied there. I think so.
All right, everyone, let's give another round of applause.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for sharing your knowledge with us. And we have a light reception in the back. There are vegan options if there are folks who are vegan. So please partake in the food in the back. Thank you.